Iowa became a state back in 1846 and adopted the caucus and convention system. Iowa's caucusing events happen in the middle of the presidential nominating schedule, usually in the months of March and April. The caucus events remained obscure local events for most of our state's history until the decade that brought us disco and Star Wars. A major event had to happen in order for Iowa to move out of their 126 years of fairly benign caucuses, and that happened in 1968, part of a tumultuous year indeed. Americans were largely split on their feelings about the Vietnam War and how the American government planned to stop the spread of communism throughout the world. Remember, America was fully embattled in the Cold War at this time. The division over the Vietnam War spilled into violence both inside and outside the Democratic National Convention in 1968.
National conventions are mostly seen as a large pep rally for each political party. The convention's members officially select the president and vice president candidates of their party and determines their platform as well.
Inside the 1968 convention, the Democratic members were grappling with their platform as it concerned their stance on the Vietnam War. Many Democrats were siding with McCarthy, who was an anti-war candidate, while other Democrats were siding with the Vice President Herbert Humphrey, who was for continuing the government's plan in Vietnam. Debates and disputes led to huge disagreements in the Democratic Party, and eventually Humphrey would be nominated. Humphrey would go on to lose to Republican Richard Nixon.
Outside the convention, supporters of McCarthy and general anti-war protesters gathered. When Chicago Mayor Richard Daley deployed 12,000 police officers and 15,000 state and federal officers to disperse the protesters, beatings and gassings took place. This riot became known as the Battle of Michigan Avenue, and because of the perceived violence perpetrated by the officers, many Americans watched the riots on TV will demand change in American government. The events at the Democratic National Convention will be a catalyst for change in Iowa, which leads to the Iowa gain first in the nation caucus status.
After the divisive 1968 Democratic Convention, Democratic Iowans in 1972 established reforms to help repair the party. At the core of the reforms was a need to incorporate the opinions in support of diverse population of Democrats, knowing the materials needed to be printed and sent out to give the type of involvement they wanted. It was mandated that there needed to be 30 days between the caucus and district conventions, plus 30 days between district and state conventions. With the state convention scheduled for May 20th, this meant that the latest the caucus could take place was January 24th. This new timetable put Iowa as the first caucus in the nation, even ahead of New Hampshire, who had long held this position.
Being first didn't necessarily mean that Iowa would deserve political attention from candidates or the rest of the nation. However, presidential candidate George McGovern was encouraged to campaign extensively in Iowa. His second place finish in Iowa's caucus brought him enough political attention to go on and win the nomination, because the media followed the happenings in Iowa in 1972, a precedent of candidates focusing their attention in Iowa began to develop.
4 years later, in 1976, a Democratic governor of Georgia, who wasn't considered a serious contender for presidency, won the caucus in Iowa. Eventually, Jimmy Carter would go on to win the nomination presidency, further cementing Iowa's importance and deserving of the attention given to it being the first in the nation to select their choice for president.
1976 was also a big year because the Republican Party decided to hold their caucus on the same night as the Democrats in Iowa.
Since then, Iowans have enjoyed meeting the candidates in small venues, often getting to know candidates in a much more personal way than can be done in other states. This allows Iowans to help the rest of the nation weed out candidates to help identify potential and lesser-known candidates. For example, in 2008, a lesser-known candidate named Barack Obama won the caucus in Iowa and later the presidency of the United States.
Sometimes our picks haven't predicted what the rest of the country wants, and other states have been quick to point that out. Hoping to preserve our first-in-the-nation status, the Iowa legislature has mandated that our caucus be held 8 days before other states.
Iowans hope that the 1970s leave a legacy beyond disco and the original Star Wars. Hopefully, the 70s was just the start of a long line of Iowans determining our future commander-in-chief.